The phone rang on a Tuesday evening while rain tapped against the window, the screen glowing with an unfamiliar number, and I remember staring at it for a moment, ready to let it ring out, because I almost never answer calls I don't recognize. But for some reason that night I slid my thumb across the screen and lifted it to my ear, and what I heard in the first few seconds was not hello or a polite question. It was a woman's voice breaking under the weight of something heavy, trembling, and raw, whispering that this was the worst day of her life, and my whole body froze because there is no script for answering a stranger when they start with that kind of sentence. So I said carefully, "I think you may have dialed the wrong number," but she gave this small laugh, the kind that comes out cracked and sad, and she admitted that yes, she had been trying to call her sister but must have misdialed, and she apologized over and over, saying she didn't mean to bother me, and I should just hang up. But there was something in the sound of her voice, that edge of desperation mixed with shame, and I surprised myself when I said, "You don't have to hang up if you don't want to. Sometimes telling a stranger is easier. Sometimes it helps." And there was a long pause on the other end, so long I thought she might have ended the call already. But then I heard her sigh, deep and shaky, and she said, "Fine, but you asked for it," and that was the beginning of a conversation I never expected. A conversation that would end up changing the course of my life. She cleared her throat like she had to push the words out, and then she started talking, not in a neat order, but the way people talk when the dam finally cracks and everything comes rushing through. She told me she had walked into work that morning only to be called into a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes, and after 8 years at the same company, she was told her position was being eliminated. No warning, no severance. Beyond a couple of weeks, just a polite thank you for your service and an escort out of the building with a cardboard box of her things. She said she managed to keep her face steady until she got to the parking lot, but then her car wouldn't start, the battery dead. As if the universe wanted to underline the joke, and she had to call a cab to take her home, holding that box of office supplies on her lap like some kind of trophy of failure. She laughed at herself bitterly as she said it, and then admitted that when she got back to her apartment the silence was so loud it scared her. Her sister always picked up the phone when she was upset, always, but this time she must have been on a flight, and in her panic she must have pressed the wrong number, ending up with me, and she apologized again for unloading all of this on a stranger, her voice breaking as she said it, but I told her honestly that I didn't mind listening, that I'd had days where I wished someone had just answered me without judgment, and I added, "Maybe this isn't a mistake. Maybe you were supposed to dial the wrong number tonight," and for the first time in the whole call she went quiet, then gave this soft sound that was half a laugh, half a sob, and said, "You sound like someone who actually means that," and I said I did, and something in that small exchange changed the tone between us. It wasn't just a misdial anymore, it was the beginning of a conversation we both seemed to need. What I thought would be a 5-minute misdial turned into a conversation that stretched across the whole evening, the kind of call where you glance at the clock and can't believe hours have slipped by. She told me about the little things that broke her that day, like how she dropped her coffee on the sidewalk and watched it spill while people just walked around her, or how she had to stuff her old office plants into a box and felt guilty like she was stealing. She told me she was 35, single, and worried that she had nothing to show for her years of hard work, and I told her about my own disappointments, about the job interviews that went nowhere and the nights I spent microwaving the same dinner over and over. We laughed at how pathetic it sounded when you said it out loud, but somehow laughing together made it easier to breathe. At one point, she asked me what I liked to do outside of work, and I confessed that I had a strange hobby of baking bread on Sundays. Not because I was good at it, but because the smell made me feel less alone, and she said she collected old jazz records, the kind you find in thrift stores for $1, and she'd play them on Fridays when she needed to remind herself life could still be beautiful. Somewhere between her explaining why Ella Fitzgerald was the greatest voice ever recorded and me giving her my half-baked recipe for cinnamon bread, her voice changed, lighter, more alive, and she said, "You know, you're not bad for a wrong number," and I smiled and answered, "And you're not bad for ruining my frozen dinner." We both laughed, a real laugh this time, and when we finally hung up, Neither of us wanted to admit we didn't want the call to end, but before she clicked off she said, "Maybe I'll misdial you again sometime." And I told her she didn't need to wait for an accident. She could just call, and she said fine, but you're still saved in my phone as wrong number guy, and I sat there staring at the dark screen of my phone, realizing I hadn't felt that connected to another human being in years. A few days after that first marathon conversation, I was walking through the grocery store when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first, but when I answered with a joking, "Wrong number guy here," I heard her laugh spill through the line. She said she was just checking if I remembered her voice, and before I knew it we were debating coffee beans while I stood staring at a display of oranges. That call lasted 10 minutes. A week later, I called her. No excuse, just a simple question. Had she tried baking the cinnamon bread yet? She admitted she hadn't, but she'd bought the ingredients and was bracing herself for at least one burnt loaf. That call lasted 40 minutes. Before long, it became routine. Every few days one of us would call, sometimes just to complain about traffic or ask something silly like whether you're supposed to refrigerate maple syrup, other times to talk about heavier things we didn't share with anyone else. She told me about the way losing her job had made her feel invisible, how some mornings she struggled to get out of bed. I told her about my own restless nights and the feeling that my life had stalled somewhere along the way. We laughed about little things too. She teased me about the disaster my kitchen turned into when I tried making a pie, and I teased her about the blurry photos she kept sending me of jazz records she found at thrift stores, like I was supposed to recognize every scratched album cover. Somehow, all of it felt natural. It was still strange, realizing that a stranger on the other end of a misdial now knew the shape of my days better than most people I'd known for years. But each time I saw her number light up my phone, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, anticipation. One night, about 2 months after that first call, she rang me close to midnight. Her voice was quieter than usual, not broken like the first time, but softer, like she was carrying something she didn't want to drop. I asked if she was okay. There was a pause, then she said, "Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone else?" I told her she could. She admitted that she hadn't called her old coworkers since the layoff, not one of them. She said she felt like if she reached out, it would make her loss more real, like she'd be begging for scraps of attention from people who had already moved on. Then she laughed bitterly and added, "But I call you a stranger, like you're the one person who won't judge me." I sat there in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, realizing that what had started as an accident was now a lifeline for her. And if I was honest, it had become the same for me. I told her the truth, that I looked forward to her calls more than anything else in my week, that she made me laugh in ways I didn't know I still could, and that I didn't think of her as a stranger anymore. She didn't answer right away. Then I heard her sniff, and she said, "That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in years." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just casual conversation. This was the start of something real, something fragile but growing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt grateful that I had picked up the phone that night. By the time spring rolled around, our calls had become a rhythm in both of our lives. Some lasted only 10 minutes, just enough to trade stories about burnt toast or long commutes, while others stretched past midnight, covering everything from the books we were reading to the regrets we carried. But eventually, the unspoken questions started to hang between us. One evening, after a long talk about music and memories, she said quietly, "Isn't it weird that I know the sound of your laugh, but not the look on your face?" I laughed, but it was true. We'd built this entire connection through a line of static and voices, but not once had we met in person. She hesitated, then added, "What if we did? What if we just grabbed coffee one day? Nothing fancy, just proof we're not making each other up." I felt my chest tighten, not because I didn't want to, but because the idea was both exciting and terrifying. Meeting in real life meant stepping out of the safety of the phone calls into a space where silences couldn't be hidden, where first impressions suddenly mattered. But I said yes. I told her we should pick a cafe halfway between us, somewhere neutral, with plenty of people around so it wouldn't feel like pressure. She agreed, and we set a date for the following week. When the day came, I found myself standing outside the cafe 15 minutes early, my palms sweaty, my heart pounding like I was a teenager about to confess a crush. I kept telling myself, this is just coffee, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it was more. It was the moment we'd see if what we had on the phone could survive face to face, and then the door opened, and she walked in, looking around until her eyes found mine, and the smile that spread across her face told me everything I needed to know. The cafe was warm, filled with the scent of roasted beans and the low hum of conversation, and for a second I stood frozen by the door, afraid the whole thing would feel different in person. Then she spotted me, waved, and that nervous energy melted into something almost familiar. She looked a little different than I'd imagined, her hair pulled back, no makeup, just a natural ease, but her smile was the same one I'd pictured during every phone call. I walked over, we hugged quickly, the kind of hug people give when they're not sure if they're allowed but both want to anyway. We sat by the window, mugs between us, and for the first 5 minutes it felt strange. Every silence seemed louder, every gesture more obvious. She laughed nervously and said, "Well, now you know I wave my hands too much when I talk." I grinned and answered, "And now you know I stir my coffee even when I don't put sugar in it." Those small admissions broke the tension, and suddenly it was like being back on the phone, except better. She told me the coffee was on her, because I'd once convinced her life was too short for cheap beans. I told her next time it would be my turn, and she raised an eyebrow like she was already holding me to it. We talked for 2 hours, slipping into the same rhythm we'd built over months, except now there was eye contact, gestures, the occasional interruption of a laugh we couldn't hide behind static. When we finally stood to leave, I walked her to her car. She looked at me for a long moment, then said softly, "I'm glad I misdialed." I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside me, and answered, "Me too." Driving home, I kept replaying her smile in my mind, realizing this wasn't just a lucky accident anymore. It was something worth holding on to. After that first coffee, meeting in person became part of the rhythm, like a natural extension of the calls we'd already made a habit. At first it was cautious, a lunch here, a quick stop at the bookstore there, but soon it grew into dinners, weekend walks, and the kind of casual drop-ins that only happen when two people trust the space they share. She came over one Sunday afternoon while I was baking bread. She stood in my kitchen laughing as I dusted flour all over the counter, insisting I was doing it wrong, and before long she had her hands in the dough too, turning my clumsy loaf into something almost respectable. I still remember the way she grinned, flour streaked across her cheek, saying, "See? This is why people aren't supposed to cook alone." Another time, I helped her haul a stack of records up the narrow stairs to her apartment, and she put one on the turntable right there while we sat on the floor among cardboard sleeves and scratched vinyl. She closed her eyes, swaying lightly to Billie Holiday's voice, and said softly, "This is the only thing that's never let me down." I didn't know what to say, so I just listened with her, letting the music say what words couldn't. Little by little, the shape of my days began to change. Where before I might have come home, microwaved something bland, and watched the hours slip away, now there were calls, visits, plans to look forward to. She pulled me out of routines I didn't even know were suffocating me, and I gave her space to lay down the weight of her loneliness, without judgment. Of course, it wasn't perfect. We had moments of silence, moments where the calls felt heavier, where one of us was short or distracted. But even then, there was comfort in knowing the other person would be there again tomorrow, or the next day, with a call, a laugh, or a knock at the door. And somewhere in those weeks of shared bread, music, and late-night talks, a truth started to take shape between us. What began as a wrong number was slowly turning into the right connection at exactly the right time. Friendship, even the kind that grows out of something as unlikely as a wrong number, isn't immune to bumps. Ours came one evening when I called and she didn't pick up. Normally, she would text back within minutes if she missed a call, but this time there was nothing. An hour passed, then 2. By the next morning, I convinced myself something was wrong. I tried again, still no answer. When she finally called back the following afternoon, her tone was distant, clipped. She said she'd been out with a couple of old friends who wanted to celebrate her new job offer, and her phone had died. I told her it was fine, but the truth was I felt left out, which was ridiculous. We weren't family, we weren't partners, we were two people who had stumbled into each other's lives by chance. Still, I'd grown so used to being the person she turned to first that realizing she had other people she could lean on stung more than I wanted to admit, and maybe I let that sting show, because she suddenly went quiet and said, "You're not mad, are you?" I laughed it off, said no, of course not, but the laugh came out too sharp. She sighed and said, "I don't want you to think I only call you when I'm falling apart. I want you to know I choose to talk to you. That's different." Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about it that way, but she was right. She wasn't leaning on me because she had no one else. She was leaning on me because she wanted to. That truth softened something in me. I apologized for sounding short, and she said, "Good. Because you're still saved in my phone as wrong number guy, and it would be embarrassing to explain why I deleted that contact." We both laughed, and just like that, the tension broke. It was a small misunderstanding, but it reminded me how fragile and precious the whole thing was. One wrong assumption could have turned into distance, but instead, it became another layer of honesty between us. It happened on a Thursday evening in early summer. She had mentioned during one of our calls that her mom was having some health problems, but she downplayed it, saying it was under control. Then, out of nowhere, she called me, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since that very first wrong number. She was at the hospital. Her mom had been admitted unexpectedly, and she didn't know what to do. I didn't think. I just grabbed my keys and drove. We hadn't made a habit of leaning on each other in person for serious things yet, but this felt different, urgent. When I walked into the sterile lobby, scanning the faces under the fluorescent lights, I spotted her in the corner, sitting stiffly in a chair with her arms wrapped around herself. She looked up, saw me, and her eyes widened in surprise. "You came," she whispered, as if she hadn't really believed I would. "Of course I did," I said simply. And I sat down beside her. We didn't talk much in those first hours. We just sat, watching the endless shuffle of nurses, doctors, and worried families. I bought us both terrible coffee from the vending machine. When her mom was finally moved to a room, I waited with her until visiting hours ended, then walked her out to the parking lot. She leaned against her car, exhausted, and said, "I don't think I could have done this alone tonight." "You don't have to," I told her. That moment shifted something between us. It wasn't just phone calls and coffee dates anymore. It was showing up. It was proof that what we had wasn't fragile or imaginary. It was real, and it mattered. Driving home that night, I thought back to the very first call, how random and ridiculous it had seemed at the time. And now here we were, sitting side by side in the harsh light of a hospital waiting room, not as strangers, but as something closer, something neither of us had seen coming. It didn't take long before the people in our lives began to notice the shift. Her sister, finally back from her work travels, asked who it was she kept sneaking off to call late at night. She told me later she brushed it off with a laugh, saying just a friend, though the look on her sister's face had been skeptical. On my side, a coworker teased me one afternoon when I smiled at my phone after reading one of her texts. "Who's got you grinning like that?" he asked, and I just shook my head, pretending it was nothing, though inside I knew it wasn't nothing. There were small ripples too. When we'd meet for coffee, the barista started to recognize us, joking once that we must be in some kind of book club. When she introduced me to an old college friend who happened to stop by, I caught the curious look in her friend's eyes, the kind of look people give when they're trying to figure out what exactly two people are to each other. It wasn't that either of us wanted to hide what we had, it was just hard to explain. How do you tell someone, "This is the person who was supposed to be a stranger, but instead became the first person I want to call when life falls apart or when something amazing happens?" Of course, with the attention came doubts too. One night, after we'd spent the whole day wandering through a flea market and laughing over ridiculous finds, she grew quiet. I asked her what was wrong, and after a long pause she said, "Do you ever wonder what this looks like to other people? Like maybe we're too close or too dependent." I thought about it, then told her the truth. "I don't care what it looks like. All I know is my life is better with you in it. That's enough for me." She didn't answer right away, but then she reached across the table, brushed a crumb off my sleeve, and said softly, "Yeah, that's enough for me too." It was the first time I realized how much weight her presence carried in my life and how much I must have come to mean in hers. It happened suddenly, and it shook me more than I expected. For months, our calls and meetings had become such a regular part of life that I stopped thinking about what it would feel like if they weren't there. Then one week went by without a word from her. I told myself she was busy. A new project at work maybe, or family matters. But as the second week slipped by, the silence grew heavier. I left a message or two, nothing dramatic, just hey, how are you, and got no reply. At night, I would glance at my phone, waiting for it to light up with her name, and when it didn't, I felt that old loneliness I thought I'd left behind creeping back. By the third week, I caught myself rehearsing conversations in my head. Was I too much? Did I lean on her too hard? Did I say something I shouldn't have? The doubt ate at me. For someone who came into my life by accident, she had somehow become one of the people I needed most. And now she was gone, at least in the quiet space between our last laugh and today's silence. Finally, late on a Thursday, my phone lit up. Her name. I answered in less than a second. Her voice was soft, worn down, like she'd been carrying too much. "I'm sorry," she said before I could even speak. "I didn't mean to disappear. My mom's condition got worse. I've been back and forth to the hospital, and I didn't have the energy to talk." Relief rushed through me, but so did guilt for thinking it had been about me. I told her she didn't need to apologize, that I just wanted to know she was okay. She was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "You were the first person I wanted to call, but I didn't want to make you carry this with me." That admission cracked something open between us. I told her I wanted to carry it, that this wasn't just about sharing laughs over bread and jazz records, it was about showing up when things got hard. She cried then, quietly, and I sat in the dark listening, realizing that silence hadn't been distance. It had been her way of protecting me, even if it was the last thing I wanted. That night, we promised each other something simple: no more disappearing. No more pulling away out of fear of being a burden. We'd face the heavy parts together, even if it was just through a phone line, and from then on, our connection wasn't just a friendship born from a mistake. It was a lifeline we both chose to hold on to. It has been over a year since that first call, and sometimes I still replay it in my head. I picture myself sitting there in the quiet apartment, the rain outside, the phone buzzing with a number I didn't know. I picture the hesitation, the way my thumb hovered over the screen. I was seconds away from letting it go to voicemail, seconds from missing the voice on the other end that has since become such a vital part of my life. If I hadn't answered, I never would have known her laugh, the one that bubbles up when she's truly surprised. I never would have learned to love the smell of jazz vinyl mixed with strong coffee. I wouldn't have had someone to sit with me in silence when my own bad days arrived, or someone to remind me that even in the heaviest moments, you don't have to carry everything alone. What started as a wrong number has become one of the most important connections I've ever had. And it still amazes me how fragile the line between chance and nothing really is. A single swipe of my finger one rainy night gave me a best friend, a confidant, a piece of family I didn't know I was missing, and so I wonder, and maybe you will too, how many of the most meaningful parts of our lives begin this way, with something small, something we almost overlook. How many times do we silence the call, close the door, walk away, never knowing what we've missed? So I'll leave you with this question. What if the person who could change your life is behind the call you almost didn't answer?